On a bleak November morning in 1923, Berlin looked like a city that had lost its mind. The fog clung to rooftops, smoke from chimneys mixed with the damp air, and everywhere the same sound echoed across cobblestones. The squeal of iron wheels, the rumble of wooden carts, the shuffle of feet carrying impossible loads. Men, women, even children pushed wheelbarrows overflowing with paper notes. They were not going to the bank to deposit fortunes, nor to the market to buy luxuries. They were racing, breathless, to bakeries and stalls to buy bread before their wages dissolved into nothing. Paper drifted in the wind, bills fluttering into gutters like autumn leaves. No one bent down to pick them up. They were worthless. Imagine the faces of those in line at the bakery doors. A man clutching a sack of money, his fingers raw from the weight. A mother holding her child with one arm, and with the other arm dragging a basket filled with notes worth billions. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, not because the paper was heavy, but because fear pressed harder than any physical burden. If they waited too long, if the baker delayed, the money might already be worthless by the time bread left the oven. By the hour, by the minute, value disappeared. The enemy was no longer hunger alone, but time itself. Children, too young to grasp despair, laughed as they built towers from bricks of notes. They stacked castles of millions, toppled them, and threw paper into the air. Parents stood silently, unable to scold. What sense was there in saving the bills? They could not buy shoes, could not buy toys, could not even buy a single potato by nightfall. Housewives, weary-eyed, covered their walls with banknotes because wallpaper was out of reach. In kitchens, flames devoured stacks of marks because the paper burned longer than wood and cost less. Fireplaces glowed with the heat of entire paychecks, the ashes of dignity rising through chimneys. The grotesque played itself out in every corner of life. Restaurants changed their menus 2-3 times a day, waiters smudging chalkboards, replacing old numbers with new ones swollen so large they no longer fit on the boards. A bowl of soup that cost 10,000 marks at noon might cost 50,000 at night. Farmers sneered at paper, demanding instead shoes, coal, or cigarettes. Bank clerks shoved piles across counters, not bothering to count, but weighing them because counting digits took too long. Thieves ignored the notes. They stole wheelbarrows instead, for the wood and iron were more valuable than the billions stacked inside. But how had an entire nation collapsed into absurdity? Only 5 years earlier, Germany had emerged from war wounded but not annihilated. Then came the Treaty of Versailles. Reparations were set at sums so vast that no treasury could sustain them. Gold, coal, timber, steel, everything was demanded. Hundreds of billions in today's money siphoned away year after year. The government tried, but the coffers emptied. By 1921, the choice was stark: default and face invasion, or print money to pay. They chose the printing press. At first, the trick looked clever. Wages were delivered, reparations made, trade continued. Life seemed to hold together, but every wave of printed notes weakened the last. Confidence frayed, the delicate thread that makes money more than ink. By 1922, cracks widened. The US dollar, which before the war cost 4 marks, now demanded hundreds. In early 1923, it cost thousands. By summer, millions. By November, billions. Numbers became monstrous. In January 1923, bread cost 250 marks. By July, 3,465. By September, 1.5 million. By November, 200 billion. At year's end, one US dollar required 4.2 trillion marks. Denominations reached absurd heights: 1 million, 1 billion, 100 billion. Yet by the time the notes reached the public, they were already obsolete. Printing presses thundered day and night, devouring forests of paper, consuming oceans of ink. Clerks stamped zeros frantically, filling ledgers with digits, until pages seemed to buckle under the weight of numbers. For the middle class, this collapse was not only material, but spiritual. Professors, doctors, engineers, Pillars of society who had built their lives on savings and education watched in disbelief as pensions built over decades dissolved. A teacher who had saved for 20 years found his entire account bought a loaf of bread. A doctor sold his library for potatoes. An engineer traded his best suit for coal. Furniture vanished from houses, pianos for sacks of flour, silverware for meat. The shame cut deeper than hunger. Families who had believed in prudence now stood in line, gaunt and desperate, their dignity stripped by paper. Meanwhile, the world beyond Germany closed its doors. No foreign trader accepted marks. German exporters could not import raw materials unless they paid in gold or foreign currency. Factories starved, shutters closed, and unemployment spread like disease. Then came another blow. In 1923, France and Belgium, impatient with unpaid reparations, invaded the Ruhr to seize coal and steel directly. German workers responded with strikes. The government, desperate to support them, printed more money to cover wages. What had been disaster turned to catastrophe. And yet, amid collapse, some thrived. Those with land, gold, or dollars survived. Merchants with foreign contacts grew rich. Smugglers carried goods across borders, selling at obscene prices. Black markets flourished. Bribes bought what money could not. The gap between those with assets and those without became a canyon. For the ordinary citizen, trapped with paper, life was hunger and humiliation. By November, life bordered on madness. A tram ticket cost billions. A kilogram of meat required a sack of notes. Salaries were paid in barrels, wheelbarrows, suitcases. Counting became impossible. People weighed their wages. Some notes were worth less than the paper used to print them. Children glued bills into notebooks because school supplies cost too much. Housewives lined shelves with notes because wood was scarce. Beggars refused money. They demanded bread directly. Germany in 1923 was a stage of chaos. Money, the foundation of order, had turned into theater. Every day was an absurd race. Every transaction mocked the very idea of value. People no longer asked how much something cost. They asked how long the price would hold. Confidence was gone, and without confidence, money was only paper. By the final weeks of 1923, Germany's financial system had become a hollow shell. Shopkeepers no longer bothered to write prices and numbers. They scribbled words instead. Millions, billions, trillions. Because zeros no longer fit on chalkboards. Banks printed notes on one side only to save time. In Leipzig, printers cut corners further, stamping numbers over outdated bills because there was no point designing new paper that would be worthless within days. Children played with bundles of notes in parks while adults looked on with eyes emptied of hope. Money had become both joke and curse. The numbers bordered on madness. Bread that cost 250 marks in January was 200 billion by November. A tram ride in Berlin, once 10 pfennigs, now demanded tens of billions. Wages were handed out daily, sometimes twice daily. Not because generosity had grown, but because if workers waited until evening, their pay would no longer buy a meal. Employees rushed from factories to markets, desperate to trade stacks of notes for food before the next price rise. Industrial plants shut down midday so workers could salvage value. Housewives rose before dawn to queue at bakeries, clutching baskets of paper, praying that ovens had not cooled before their turn came. Savings evaporated entirely. The middle class, that stabilizing layer of teachers, clerks, lawyers, and engineers, collapsed. Yet generations who had lived modestly but securely saw their prudence turn to dust. A pension that once guaranteed dignity in old age bought a single egg. The shock was not only hunger, but humiliation. People who had trusted in banks, in savings books, in contracts written on sturdy paper now burned that paper in stoves. Confidence itself had turned to ash, and the consequences stretched beyond economics. International trade with Germany collapsed. No foreign merchant would accept the mark. Importers demanded gold, dollars, or pounds. Without raw materials, German factories starved. Production shrank. Unemployment soared, yet foreign creditors still pressed for payment. France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, seizing coal and steel as reparations. The German state, unwilling to abandon its workers, printed even more to pay striking miners and idle employees. The spiral, already vicious, became catastrophic. Foreign journalists described a country living in surreal absurdity. Reports told of professors begging in the streets, of children using banknotes as scrap paper, of shopkeepers weighing bills on scales. The spectacle of collapse fascinated outsiders, but for Germans there was no fascination, only despair. A lifetime of savings could vanish between sunrise and sunset. The knowledge that money could not be trusted seeped into the marrow of society. By November, the crisis reached its climax. It now took 4.2 trillion marks to buy a single US dollar. Denominations stretched into the trillions, yet still failed to keep up with reality. Notes piled up like rubbish. The very concept of value dissolved. People stopped asking how much and instead asked, how long will this price last? Time, not price, became the measure of trade. It was then that a desperate solution emerged. Chancellor Gustav Stresemann and economist Hjalmar Schacht proposed a new currency, the Rentenmark. Unlike the old mark, it was not backed by gold. Germany's gold reserves were long gone, but by real assets: land, industry, factories, agricultural property. Each Rentenmark was issued against mortgages placed on German land and businesses. The conversion was staggering. One Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old marks. Yet, astonishingly, the public accepted it. Confidence, once shattered, flickered back to life. Bread suddenly cost a price people could count. Markets returned to stability. Shops once again displayed goods with labels that held meaning. The printing presses slowed. For the first time in years, people could breathe. The nightmare had halted. But halting a nightmare does not erase it. Millions had lost everything. Families who had worked, saved, and trusted saw their lives reduced to ash. The German middle class, the cultural and intellectual foundation of the nation, was humiliated and broken. The trauma sank deep. It left scars that no new currency could heal. Years later, Adolf Hitler would return to these scars like a surgeon prodding an old wound. He reminded Germans of the wheelbarrows, of the hunger, of the absurdity of children playing with worthless bills. He spoke of betrayal, of humiliation, of the need for strong leadership to prevent chaos from returning. To a population still haunted by 1923, the memory was raw. They listened. They believed. Stability, order, dignity. These promises mattered more than liberty. The wheelbarrows of 1923 became political fuel for tyranny. The lesson of that year was not confined to economics. It revealed how fragile societies become when trust in money collapses. Money is not metal or paper. It is confidence. The belief that tomorrow a note will hold the same meaning it holds today. When that belief shatters, no decree can restore it quickly. And in the vacuum left behind, fear takes root. Fear makes people cling to anyone who promises certainty, no matter how dark the promise may be. The German hyperinflation remains one of history's most dramatic warnings. But it is not unique. In Zimbabwe during the 2000s, banknotes of $100 trillion circulated, so worthless they were sold as souvenirs abroad. In Venezuela in the 2010s, Bolivar bills piled in trash heaps because they could not buy toilet paper. In Argentina, decades of inflation eroded wages, forcing citizens to spend salaries the moment they arrived. The names differ, but the pattern is the same. Printing presses turned loose, confidence lost, dignity crushed. The image of wheelbarrows filled with wages survives because it captures something deeper than statistics. It shows human fragility before numbers gone mad. It shows families stripped of their savings, parents reduced to barter, children growing up knowing that paper meant nothing. It shows that societies, however modern, can unravel in silence when trust dissolves. By the end of 1923, Germany had stabilized on the surface, but beneath the memory remained. The Rentenmark restored order, but it could not restore trust. It could not restore the faith of a teacher who had lost his pension, or the dignity of a widow whose savings had bought nothing but ashes. Those wounds festered. They hardened into resentment, into anger, into a hunger for certainty that would shape the decade to come. This is why the story of Wheelbarrows is more than absurd history. It is a mirror. It warns that financial systems are not eternal, that governments, when pressed, may yield to the temptation of printing, that once confidence breaks, it does not bend gently, it snaps. And when it snaps, society itself unravels. The day Germany paid wages with wheelbarrows of money remains one of history's starkest images. It was not just money that collapsed, it was dignity. And once dignity is destroyed, any promise of rescue, no matter how dangerous, can find listening ears. The silence of families who lost everything still echoes. The image of worthless bills drifting through Berlin streets still lingers. And the lesson still applies. Money is paper, value is trust, and trust once broken can vanish in a single morning.